Hello, this is Trish Thomas-Mink with another story of the 20th century, American history. And this one centers around World War II and a German operation on American soil called Operation Pastorius. Now, as I was growing up, I often heard that except for Pearl Harbor, World War II was not fought on American soil. Later, I found out that my textbooks did not exactly tell the full story. There were several attempts on our mainland, and Operation Pastorius was one of those attempts. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese occurred on December 7th, 1941. Before that time, the United States technically had not joined the war. In 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt provided aid to Britain and was sort of in a preparatory state. He was preparing for the possibility of war. The attack by the Japanese demanded that the U.S. enter the war, at least in the Pacific arena. Within 4 days, on December 11th, 1941, Hitler followed up Japan's strike by declaring war on the United States. Now the U.S. was fully involved in World War II on both sides of the continent. Full of vitriol for the United States, Hitler commanded an admiral, Wilhelm Canaris, to lead an operation that would sabotage the American war effort and attack civilian targets to demoralize the American civilian population inside the U.S. The mission was called, as I said, Operation Pastorius. Though this Admiral Canaris led the operation for Germany, he was an interesting fellow. He was an early follower of Hitler in the early 30s, but as he witnessed the dialogue and then the massacre of the Polish people and priests, he changed his view completely of Hitler and of the war efforts. The rest of that war, he spent much of the time creating sabotage and even attempted to assassinate Hitler a couple of times, or so the rumor goes. It makes you wonder, was the failure of Operation Pastorius intentional? Canaris was a World War I veteran of Germany who oversaw espionage, and it is said that he controlled the famous female spy Mata Hari in Paris. He started as an intelligence officer in World War I aboard the SMS Dresden naval ship in the Pacific. Canaris escaped from Chile and the Royal Navy following the Battle of the Masa Terra using his fluency in Spanish. He talked his way out. It was then where he came to the attention of the German naval intelligence. And because of that, Hitler was impressed and put him in charge of this intelligence operation in World War II. Now, in 1942, Germany recruited 8 German residents that had experience with the U.S. Now, 2 were American citizens that actually lived here, Ernest Berger and Herbert Hoppel. And the others had worked in the U.S. George John Dash, Edward John Curling, Richard Quirin, Heinrich Ham Heinrich, Hermann Otto Neubauer, and Werner Thiel. Now, Germany spent a lot of money. They created dossiers for these people with backstories and provided them with and all kinds of training, but they provided them with about $175,000 in 1942 dollars. They were recruited into a group called Abwehr, and Abwehr was an intelligence organization operating on U.S. soil. Now, these men were dropped off at night along the east coast of the U.S. Now, the first submarine was carrying Dash, Quirin, Heinrich, and Curling. And on the night of June 12th, 1942, the submarine captain Linder put the 4 men on shore in New York. Now, for a time, the submarine had gotten too close to the coastline, and it got stuck in the mud. So here it is, along the shoreline, this big black tube in the dark of night, right next to a road where people drove. And luckily for them, before the dawn came, the tide rose, and they were able to make their escape back out to sea. The men came ashore near Manganset, New York, on the south shore of Long Island. They buried explosive primers, incendiary devices, and their uniforms in the sand. They changed into American-style clothing and headed into Manhattan. Once in NYC, they split up into two pairs. The mission was expected to last about 2 years in total, and the other 4 members landed near Jacksonville, Florida. They arrived at night in swimsuits, walked ashore, changed into street attire, and dispersed to Ohio and Illinois. Now, as the first group showed up in New York, a member of the Coast Guardsmen, the U.S. Coast Guard, John Cullen, spotted Dash. Dash bribed him with $260 to keep quiet. The money exchanged hands, but Cullen reported the incident anyway. The Coast Guard also ended up finding the stash of munitions and clothing. As the men made their way into Manhattan, a manhunt had already begun to track them. A few days later, in the Mayflower Hotel in New York City, Dash told Berger that he had no intention of fulfilling the mission. He hated Nazism and wanted out. He told Berger if there was any problem with that, he would throw him out a window. Dash at first tried to telephone the FBI and tell them his story, but they didn't believe him. So within days, Dash took a train to Washington, D.C. and showed up in person at the offices of the FBI. He met with Director D. Milton Ladd, dumping $84,000 in cash on his desk. That was their allotted budget. It also convinced the FBI they were telling the truth. So while the FBI was questioning him, they sent agents to follow Berger. Berger went to meet Heinrich and Quirin at a clothing store, and the FBI showed up and arrested all 3 men. After questioning Dash for hours, they allowed him to return to the Mayflower Hotel. They basically let him go. By June 22, 1942, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the first director of the FBI, sent word to President Roosevelt that the FBI had single-handedly discovered and foiled a German plot in the U.S. The FBI took credit for the entire bust, though it would be about June 27th when all suspects, all 8 of them, were arrested and jailed. Now, Dash and Curling were actually team leaders, and they were provided with a list of contacts in the U.S. who can help the men as needed. The list was written on a handkerchief in invisible ink. Now, as Dash was relating the story to the FBI, he conveniently said he forgot how to illuminate the names. He didn't know how to get the names out of it. The FBI discovered ammonia would reveal the names, and they were all immediately put under surveillance. Now, Curling and Teal were arrested when they contacted one of the names on the handkerchief helmet liner. Curling wanted to borrow, quote unquote, one of Lerner's mistresses. Upon meeting at a bar, Curling, Teal, and its liner, I think, were all arrested. Herbert Hopple was the youngest man on the team. He was only 22 years old, and he had been living in Chicago with his family, and he actually had a job. He was an optician's apprentice. He also had a girlfriend that got pregnant, and it was thought that he left the area because of that. He just took off. She later had a miscarriage. But when he left, it made him a draft dodger from the U.S. military. Hopple traveled to Mexico. He went to the German embassy down there. He got a German passport and went back to Germany, which is where the German government recruited him from. Now he was back in Chicago. He reunited with his family and his girlfriend. And like all of the men of this operation, he was carrying on him $4,000 plus $450 for immediate expenses. So what does a 22-year-old do? Well, this one bought a car and proposed to his girlfriend. Hopple then went to the FBI and told them that he had been away and he would square things with the draft board. Though they were already aware of the situation, they let him believe that they weren't and sent him home. They used him to follow and to find the other, actually to find Neubauer. But Hoppel, too, had abandoned the plot. And finally, the FBI just got tired of following him around nowhere, picked him up, and immediately he gave up Herman Neubauer's location, who was at the Sheridan Plaza Hotel. Now, Neubauer had been passing his time by watching movies at the cinema and was arrested coming home from a show. All 8 men were accounted for, and the FBI finally went back and arrested Dash. Dash thought he was going to be a witness and not prosecuted, but that wasn't the case at all. All 8 were arrested and put on trial. President Roosevelt, fearing that the people would go easy on the men at trial, set up a special tribunal. The men were tried in secret at the Department of Justice. All 8 were found guilty of breaking the law of war and spying. Now, the law of war is an international law with a code of conduct for operating during a war, which includes laws for behavior of the warring parties. Dash and Berger survived, but the other 6 were executed by electric chair and buried in a pauper's grave. Dash and Berger were given clemency in 1948 and sent back to an American area of Germany. They could not go back to the main part of Germany because they were considered traitors. Somewhere in the 1960s or 70s, a monument was erected to the executed Germans. The Nationalist Socialist White People's Party was said to have placed a monument in a wooded area in southwest Washington, D.C., and it stayed there until park officials removed it in 2010. So what is that, like 50, 60 years? Hitler was going to use these men to target infrastructure, transportation, and public services. He recruited men that would target areas with a larger Jewish population, as he felt the Jews had undue influence over the Americans. Had the Germans been successful, their efforts would have been impressive. Here are a list of the proposed attacks. A hydroelectric plants, more than one, at Niagara Falls in New York. The Aluminum Company of America in Illinois, Tennessee, in New York. Locks on the Ohio River near Louisville, Kentucky. Penn Salt Factory in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. The Horseshoe Curve, a crucial railroad pass near Altoona, Pennsylvania. The Cryolite Plant in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Hell's Gate Bridge in New York. Pennsylvania Station at Newark, New Jersey. And they were also told to plant explosives on bridges, at railroad stations, water facilities, and in public places. During World War II, there were other attempts on U.S. soil by the Germans. Just the year before Operation Pastorius, the Duquesne, pronounced Duquesne, it's spelled D-U-Q-U-E-S-N-E. I had to look it up, but it's Duquesne. The Duquesne network of German espionage agents were uncovered, and upon trial, the U.S. obtained a total of 33 convictions out of that. Also, Operation Elster was an intelligence-gathering mission in Maine of 1944. The mission was unsuccessful when William Colpaw, an American defected to Germany, lost interest in the whole mission after shortly arriving in the U.S. He took off with all the money and abandoned the other agent, Eric Gimpel. Colpaw turned himself into the FBI, who arrested both men. They were tried, convicted, sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life in prison. Now, both of these men were released from prison, Gimpel in 1955 and Colpaw in 1960. And that's it for now. Have a good week. If you like this story, smash the subscribe button. There will be more to come.